Super. So, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Soha Youssef, and I'm convening the seminar series on behalf of UNU-MERIT and Maastricht University in the Netherlands. The Migration Seminar Series invites researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and others to discuss their work related to migration. Before I will introduce today's speaker, there are some housekeeping that I'll need to do. Our speaker's talk will last approximately 40 minutes, after which 20 minutes are for discussion and questions from the audience. I'd like to ask you to keep your questions until after our speaker is done with their presentation, unless, of course, it's a clarification question. And then when we're done with the presentation, you can either write your question in the chat box or use the raise the hand function on Zoom. We will then allocate turns accordingly. In the meantime, please keep your microphones muted. Your camera can be turned on if you would like to, but as I mentioned, please be aware that we are recording the seminar for distribution on our YouTube channel. On our YouTube channel, you can also find recordings of previous migration seminar series in the past years. And now let me introduce today's speaker. Bushra Ebadi is a lead research associate at the United Nations University Operating Unit on Policy-Driven Electronic Governance. She brings a wealth of expertise in areas like digital justice, climate justice, and intersectional policy making. Her work addresses the rights of marginalized communities, particularly in conflict zones, with experience at organizations like Amnesty International and various UN agencies. She's a social innovator and advocate for global justice and co-founder of HILA Alliance. If you'd like to know more about Bushra, you can check out her profile on our website. And with that being said, let me give the floor to Bushra. Bushra, welcome to the seminar.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for the invitation to speak about one of the projects that I'm co-leading with a colleague. Really, I think this is a collaborative effort with many external partners and individuals. So I also wanted to acknowledge that and invite folks to also join. And now I'll share a means to be able to do so at the end of the presentation. So this presentation is going to be on safeguarding digital cultural heritage in crisis, and I very intentionally put digital in brackets because it's both acknowledging that there are certain cultural heritage that are inherently digital now that have been created online or using digital tools, but also looking at the ways that digital tools can be either enabling or undermining cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible. The specific focus of this presentation will be on one of the context or cultural focus areas, which is on Palestine, but we're also looking at Syria and Afghanistan as two other areas of focus as part of this initiative, and we'll likely expand the initiative to include more contexts. Okay. So before we get into the main presentation, I wanted to start with a little bit of an icebreaker activity. For those of you who are already joining us by the Zoom conference, this will be a little bit easier to engage with, but we'll do a quick exercise. And so I like to invite people to think about what's your favorite vegetable, fruit, flower, plant, and we'll maybe do a round of people sharing what that is, and it's basically part of this activity of what's in your basket. So I'll give everybody about a minute to think about it, and maybe if you're able to use like the raise hand function on the Zoom, then we can have volunteers to share as you're identifying which of your favorite like fruit, vegetable, or plants you want to share. Okay, so maybe
Would you like me to start?
folks. Sure.
You unmuted me, I think.
Okay.
Would you like me to just mention one of my favorites or all of them? Like all the different categories?
That's a great question. Maybe just one of them.
Perfect. I would say my favorite fruit is raspberries.
Okay. And I think we can go to Melissa next, and then maybe we'll popcorn it to the next person. And you're on mute, Melissa.
I was going to say almost the same thing. So I would maybe say the category of berries in general, if I'm allowed to do that.
Yeah, you can say that. Anybody else want to share?
For
maybe Emma?
fruits, I'm going to go with olives. And I just realized that they're fruits, so I learned something new just now.
Yeah, that's a great one. Then maybe we'll go to Emma next.
Yeah, I think my favorite flowers are bluebells. They were always around when I was growing up, so I always associate it with home.
That's beautiful. Lillian, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Please correct me if it's wrong.
No worries. I'd say figs. I love figs.
Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else want to share that's joining us? No pressure. If you don't have any favorites that come to the top of your mind or don't want to share, you can also type it in the chat as well.
Yeah,
so
I was going to
can...
say Abdi Salam has his answer written in the chat.
Okay, I can't see the chat, so maybe feel free to read
Let
out
me
the
say it then. So Abdi Salam shared banana, tomatoes, sunflowers. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I'll then go into the follow-up question, and maybe we'll do like a show of hands, or if you want to type in the chat. How many of you know where that specific fruit, vegetable, or flower has been cultivated or where it originates from? And so raise your hand if you do, and or maybe type in the chat if you know about this. Yeah, and so part of the reason that I like to do this activity is because one of my favorite flowers is the tulip. And most people associate it with the Netherlands, when in reality, actually, the origin of the tulip is in the lands that we currently call Iran and Afghanistan, so my own ancestral lands. And it has this deep meaning. It's true and unabiding love. That's what the tulip represents for us culturally. And I think about it in the ways that like our ancestors have cultivated or helped to nurture certain plants or flowers or fruit. And yet like they're often restricted from being able to move, whereas the things that have been commodified are easily moving across borders and often in exploitive ways. So we're not often asked to like think about this question of like where do these things come from and what are the communities that they're connected to, and who helped to nurture this and like the knowledges and cultures that we benefit from, but we may not actually realize. And so it's a different way of looking at how we value each other and our connections. And to prompt you to also maybe do a search of where your favorite fruit, vegetable, or flower originates from, and all of the ways that it, was nurtured in order to be able to reach you, or in some ways actually exploited. So with that, I'll go to our actual main part of the presentation. So I'll give a little bit of a background as to why I'm focusing on this particular topic. Palestinian heritage has been under threat due to conflict and violence since the 1920s. So what we're seeing currently is not new, but in fact, it's an acceleration of that trend. Heritage in Gaza and the West Bank in particular are under attack currently and are threatened by mass atrocities. That includes acts of cultural cleansing and genocide, and I'll give examples of what that looks like in connection to digital technologies and how they're being used to support these acts. That destruction of cultural heritage, as I mentioned, has accelerated since 2023, in particular in October. And it's now presenting a dire situation for the wholesale destruction of the memory and heritage of Palestine and the world, because we consider the destruction of cultural heritage of a peoples to be the destruction of our collective heritage as humanity. So the forced displacement of Palestinians, including the descendants of Palestinian refugees from the 1948 Nakba, in particular, has threatened the preservation and safeguarding of ancestral heritage and the rights of Palestinians and their deep connection with their land. And we'll kind of highlight that throughout this presentation. So after seeing the destruction of cultural heritage in various ways, and also understanding that this is a pattern that we've seen repeated in history, where certain targeted communities, cultures are especially, it's almost like this systematic way of being able to commit these mass atrocities against a people, and to try to erase them and undermine their sense of community. And so we've seen this historically through the Holocaust, the various genocides that we've seen in Darfur, that we're seeing in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Hawaii, in what we consider or call Turtle Island, so amongst the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And there's many examples to choose from, which is quite unfortunate. But what I find is that oftentimes we have systems or policies that undermine or undervalue the destruction of cultural heritage, and don't see it as maybe being on the same level of killing people en masse, where in fact the whole conception of genocide entailed the destruction of culture as a key component, by the individual and scholar Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term itself and who was one of the key pen holders for the cultural genocide, or the Genocide Convention, sorry. There was this exclusion of the cultural aspect from the Genocide Convention itself, and that was seen to be as a result of the accountability that would then be afforded for many of the key signatories who were committing genocide against Indigenous peoples as part of their settler colonial projects. And so the purpose of this project of safeguarding digital cultural heritage in crisis is to be able to both enrich scholarship and co-develop knowledge with the communities that are being directly affected. And in this case, Palestinians who are both on their land, but also in diaspora. And to be able to also build capacity of artists, cultural practitioners, and policymakers to be able to do this work in a crisis context more effectively, as well as being able to connect them with institutions or resources to support that work. And then be able to disseminate both this knowledge that we're generating together, as well as the best practices and the tools that we're identifying and co-creating. And that can also be taking place via some of the different activities that we've anticipated or are already undertaking as part of the project. So some of the key activities that the project entails includes the designing of strategic foresight and community participatory research workshops. So I've led about 3 of these so far. One of them recently took place in Taipei as part of RightsCon, which is a conference on human rights in the digital age. So looking at that intersection between human rights and technology. And so we led a hybrid session, being able to connect folks both online and in person, to be able to map out some of the key issues and identify ways that digital technologies are both undermining, but also could be supporting the safeguarding of cultural heritage in this specific context. We've been conducting desk research, so reviewing existing literature, scholarship, as well as guides that may exist from some of the key institutions on how to safeguard cultural heritage, and looking at it in the context of Palestine in particular. Looking to nurture community of practice and identify key experts, and really broadening our definition of what an expert entails, because many of the key knowledge holders for cultural practitioners have not necessarily been afforded recognition and support for their practices and the knowledge that they're really embodying in many ways. So that's also been a key concern, that the killing or targeting of these individuals ends up cutting off the dissemination or the ability to share across generations that specific practice or knowledge. Then mobilizing and facilitating, as well as curating knowledge, opportunities, and resources. So I've developed an Airtable database to be able to share this with people within the community of practice, to be able to more effectively apply for opportunities for funding together, but also share out learning tools and resources with people in ways that could be more accessible to them, but also working with institutions to develop these training guides or tools in accessible formats and ways, acknowledging that internet connectivity has been a particular challenge for people in Gaza, as well as the West Bank. And then finally, to leverage some of these insights that we're able to generate through this research and work together to influence and inform the development of policy, regulations, and governance at the intersection of culture and technology. Really also understanding that much of our existing frameworks, including around the terms for things like ceasefires or the protection of cultural heritage, writ large under the Genocide Convention itself, but also the Geneva Convention and other international legal frameworks, does not necessarily have the nuance to cover some of these specific attacks using these advanced technologies, such as AI and machine learning tools. So we're going to do a brief review of some of our key findings so far in the research that we've conducted. And this is fairly early in the research, so I anticipate that we'll have quite a bit more to share with folks, and I encourage you to stay connected with us to be able to follow along in that work, and hopefully be able to support the work as well. So I'm basically categorizing it into like two parts in this part of the presentation. So there's the examples of tech facilitated destruction of cultural heritage, but then I'll also share examples of the ways technology can be used to actually safeguard cultural heritage as well. So right now we're seeing the deployment of advanced digital technologies, so the use of autonomous drones and AI-generated targets for weapon systems that are targeting cultural sites, as well as cultural practitioners and stewards. So we've seen how journalists in particular have been targeted by these drone technologies, and the ways in which actually the mass registration of certain populations and including them in these like weapon systems, or the actual data that's being collected on them can make them more vulnerable to being targeted, and how these systems actually may undervalue cultural heritage itself, but also criminalize and really marginalize both the individuals who are holding these practices or embodying these practices, but also the intangible and tangible heritage itself. The other challenge is that there's been a massive destruction of ICT infrastructure. This was already being undermined because of the existing and ongoing blockade in Gaza in particular, that has limited internet connectivity and resulted in internet shutdowns at various points. Right now, a lot of the access for artists or cultural practitioners, as well as journalists, and really the population as a whole, has been facilitated through a movement of folks who have been sharing eSIMs to be able to connect people on the ground, to be able to share their experiences, as well as their knowledge with the wider global population, so that the genocide and apartheid is not just taking place in the dark. And I also want to prompt folks to really understand how difficult that is, and to find ways that they can support the incredible work that's being done by people who are resisting the harms that they're experiencing in various ways. And so that actual destruction of the ICT infrastructure is undermining digital archives and cultural spaces themselves. Because many of these digital archives, for example, rely on connectivity to be able to be sustained. And they also then results in being exposed to greater vulnerabilities to be erased in wholesale by the occupying forces, as well as other nefarious actors. That altering or erasing of digital records has also been taking place on social media platforms through censorship, as well as the phenomenon of shadow banning. So that's where specifically we're seeing that algorithms are designed in such ways that they share or under prioritize content that is related to what's happening in Palestine, and in particular, sharing of people's experiences of the violence and genocide, but also even their cultural heritage. So that being part and parcel to the targeted dehumanization that has been taking place for quite a few decades, but again has accelerated over the last 18 plus months. We're also seeing cyber attacks and surveillance of artists and cultural practitioners, as well as journalists, and then elders and knowledge keepers in particular. And this is not just relegated to those who are in Gaza or the West Bank, but is actually taking place across the diaspora. And it's been used as a means to undermine people's livelihoods, to get them to be banned from certain cultural spaces and institutions. And we're seeing how certain cultural institutions globally are also enforcing that type of censorship or banning and restricting artists who are of Palestinian origin or artists who are sharing about what's taking place in Palestine from being able to participate in these spaces. And then you're seeing a counter resistance to that that's being supported by advocacy online. There's also a widespread propaganda and disinformation, and this has been particularly dangerous. And when we're seeing the manufacturing of consent for these violent acts, or the specific targeting of civilians and the population writ large. So being able to share unverified, ideas or accusations of really like heinous things that actually haven't taken place. And we saw that early on in October. And then it was being actually shared by even some mainstream media platforms who were not doing due diligence in the information that was being shared. And that was creating the space to further dehumanize Palestinians and then justify the violence that they were being exposed to, as well as really trying to see them as being bereft of culture itself. And so while there's also this destruction of cultural heritage that's being facilitated by the use of advanced technologies, there's various examples in how technologies can be used to actually support the safeguarding of cultural heritage, as well as cultural practitioners themselves. And I also want to acknowledge that this isn't meant to be techno-solutionist, that actually much of these interventions need to take place with other systematic reforms and transformations that afford greater protections to culture writ large, especially the culture specifically targeted and marginalized populations globally. And in the context of genocide, this becomes, I think, increasingly pertinent and urgent. So the first is the ways that different digital technologies are being used to document and share and archive experiences of the ongoing Nakba, the apartheid, occupation, and genocide. And that's being done via social media platforms as well, in creative ways. So finding ways to actually take some of the kind of practices of clickbait, for example, to kind of prompt people to like stop while they're scrolling through social media platforms, and then take notice of what's taking place in Gaza itself, for example, in terms of the ongoing violence. And then also seeing the ways that people are developing these digital archives to be able to share across borders, or enforced separation between peoples. So to be able to actually reclaim some of their histories through these different digital channels, and to be able to have like a repository of these stories and experiences, to be able to share at a more larger scale. There are also various opportunities to convene artists and cultural practitioners in digital spaces, and creating both forums that are safe and insulated and private to community members themselves, but also ways in which advocacy and awareness raising is happening using these digital platforms. So to be able to connect people to share practices such as Crises, which is an embroidery that's specific to Palestinian culture. And I've in the slides, you might notice that there's various Crises patterns in the corner. And I recently actually had the privilege of learning Crises in Taipei, unexpectedly actually, by being adopted into this fellowship community of people who are working on digital privacy rights and different ways to actually use technology to be able to safeguard the rights of especially targeted people. And that was also a privilege that I feel deeply honored to be able to have participated in, and see how that's actually being facilitated in various places around the world, to both raise awareness of what's happening, but also to rehumanize the people who have been so severely dehumanized, as I said, for an extended period of time. There's also opportunities to engage in digital learning and capacity building, training and workshops to share this cultural knowledge and skills. And I'm seeing this increasingly take place through various channels as well, and using like Zoom or Teams as some of those spaces, but also trying to identify ways to create tools that are very specific to the communities themselves, and that are able to skirt some of the restrictions that may exist on some of these platforms, or within jurisdictions that increasingly criminalize the sharing of Palestinian culture, or just the criminalization of Palestinians as a whole. There's the ways that people are creating art online, so using digital tools, including some of the platforms like Canva, the Adobe series, but others to develop illustrations, to take part in digital graffitiing, as well as other artistic mediums, to both share their culture, but also to co-create and co-develop culture in an evolving manner in community with each other, including across borders, which has been quite interesting to be able to see folks who may have been separated as a result of the various oppressive experiences that their families or their communities have been subjected to. But to be able to reconvene in spaces and to co-create and reimagine what it means to be Palestinian together, especially during this moment of history. We're seeing how 3D and extended reality technologies can be used to document and preserve cultural heritage sites and objects virtually, but also their limitations when we see actually the destruction of like mosques or churches or entire buildings and sites. And there's particular archaeological sites that have been undermined due to basically the use of like seawater to flood some of these spaces in Gaza. So there's some like Roman archaeological sites, for example, that are quite important again for our global cultural heritage, that are being undermined because of these specific acts that are being perpetrated by occupying forces. There's been the creation of digital libraries, archives, and curated museum collections, and we've seen this in various places around the world. There's been a concentration of some of them within the American context, but also across Europe. and then across the Levant region as well. And also being able to see how there's exhibitions that are traveling in various parts of the world as well now. I particularly was able to visit one also by happenstance in Taipei at the Citizen Bookstore, which is a more rights-oriented or politically oriented bookstore in Taipei, but they had a poster exhibition of liberatory oriented posters that were being created historically to advocate on behalf of Palestinians and their right to return, as well as their right to be on their lands without being subjected to violence. And we're also seeing how certain digital technologies such as LIDAR or satellites can also be used to identify which sites are under threat or those that have been made more vulnerable due to the targeting, often using the very technologies that I mentioned on the previous slide. And so I think Soha already mentioned that I work on climate justice as well. So I wanted to share a case study or an example that looks at this intersection and then reinforces why this connection to the land is so important to Palestinians. So we're seeing, actually, there's this phenomenon of simultaneous ecocide and culturecide taking place because many of these practices are so close to and really integral to the continued existence of Palestinian people. The first of which is the targeting of the bee population. So we've seen this historically, but it's been ramped up again over the last 18 plus months, where there's the burning of beehives that are taking place, as well as the destruction of biodiversity that these bees rely on. And that's being facilitated by the use of drone technologies that are also being used to either like specifically bomb those hives themselves or to survey beekeepers and then to distribute chemical pesticides that would undermine the bee population as well as the flora that they're reliant on. And then we're also seeing the destruction of olive trees and groves. And that's also, again, being facilitated by some of these digital technologies, as well as the surveillance of people who carry this specific set of skills or knowledge to also make them feel like they're constantly under surveillance or watch and make them feel that much more vulnerable and seeing the lack of protections that are afforded to them when settlers specifically target them. And so seeing the lack of maybe state intervention or protections as actually being systematic and part of the strategy to continue to commit genocide as well as enforce apartheid on Palestinian people, and to also then separate people across historic Palestine. So that separation is often, as is the case with other instances of enforced borders, ends up separating the land itself, as well as the flora and fauna in ways that make sustaining cultural heritage quite difficult, including when we're looking at, for example, the ways that people will often cook foods or create cuisine that is quite related to what's accessible to them via the land or the water ways that they have access to. But because of that forced separation, people haven't necessarily been able to access some of those, plants or food staples that they otherwise would have been able to historically. And actually the movement of those plants and foods have been also restricted under occupation. So I also want to give you an example or a little bit of a preview of what some of our workshops look like, and I'll go through this quite quickly because I want to leave time for some questions. So this is one of the activities that I lead with folks who are participating in workshops, and the first of which is to co-create collective narratives together. So looking at the ways that arts and culture can be used as a tool for liberation, but also oppression. So we've seen how propaganda can be also spread using artistic mediums and tools. And then specifically looking at the use of advanced digital technologies to undermine cultural heritage as well as safeguard cultural heritage. And then to expand our visioning of what's possible by looking at, you know, what it would mean to have something like a digital cultural reparations take place in many different contexts, but again, focusing on this specific one for this initiative. And then I put in brackets, even a fund to think about like, how are we engaging in like mutual aid and support, but also thinking of the ways that the entities that have perpetrated some of these harms, including some of the big tech companies, for providing the AI tools to be able to facilitate the violence and the targeting of heritage sites, as well as specific individuals and cultural practitioners. How are they then being held accountable, and also being able to support the restoration of heritage that will need to take place. And so this is just, again, going through the different steps that are involved. And I'm happy to lead a session like this if it interests you or your organization. And then we take part in an activity called The Gardens We Grow. And this is about really asking us to reimagine the roles that we see ourselves playing in the safeguarding of cultural heritage. And so what can we offer to this like collective vision that we're co-creating together of what it would look like to have more collective responsibility as well as liberatory practices when it comes to the specific safeguarding of cultural heritage, but also just the ways that we would like to connect and relate with each other as peoples who are deeply connected to a specific culture, but also peoples across cultures, and what that would mean for us collectively moving forward after having witnessed or experienced these types of atrocities or crises. And so I'll kind of leave you with an invitation before opening up the space for questions. But if you'd like to take part in a mapping session to identify some of the ways that these tools are being used to both harm and safeguard, but also to identify cultural practitioners, artists, and like organizations that you think should be part of this initiative, you're more than welcome to participate with us. And I've left my email on the screen for folks to get in touch. And I look forward to connecting with all of you.
Thank you. Let's get started right away with the questions. Go ahead, Melissa.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bushra. So I have a couple of follow-up questions. So this was really fascinating and something I had not really thought of previously. And so when you were talking about like the destruction of all of this cultural heritage and how tech is being used or not and everything, I had a couple of questions here. So one thing is, how do you know that the culture as such is actually being targeted? I'm not saying that it's not happening. It's just that within war or violence or things, lots of things get destroyed, not necessarily also on purpose. So I'm just wondering in how far you actually have evidence or it's clear that these things are specifically being targeted. And then my second question is, who's targeting them, right? And in which way? Like, so you talked about ways that they're being targeted, but who's the one that's doing the targeting? And you mentioned also right now that like some social media platforms are complacent or they're sharing data, but who are they sharing data with exactly? And also like when posts are being amplified or repressed, who's behind that? So I would just like a little bit more detail in some of the things that you mentioned, if you know or if you can say.
Yeah, so some of the ways that we know that cultural heritage is being targeted is because it's been documented within the government itself. So it's part of government policy, and there's been statements made by officials. So that's one of the ways that we've been able to track some of this.
Sorry, which government?
The Israeli government. So
Okay, so the
yeah.
Israeli government, like specifically saying we have targeted this cultural site for destruction.
Yeah, so like they'll
Okay.
have it as part of their policy. And then there's also the ways in which they're not putting the effective safeguards in place to ensure that the cultural heritage is not destroyed. And so the onus is on the entity that's the occupying force. In this case, it's the Israeli forces to actually put measures in place to safeguard cultural heritage, but they haven't been effectively doing that. And we've seen just as a result of like everything that's been taking place, and the wholesale destruction of that cultural heritage, which is being tracked by UNESCO and other entities, to be able to identify what's been taking place, but also identify means to actually maybe be able to restore or safeguard some of these sites. And then also seeing actually the restrictions on being able to invite or like have people who are experts in safeguarding to even enter certain spaces. Or the tools that are necessary to support the safeguarding of cultural heritage. I think the other area that we're seeing this is because of the blockade. So the impacts of the blockade on internet in particular. So not being able to really take part in digital spaces as being an attack on culture as well. Preventing people from connecting with each other, especially because of the enforced borders and checkpoints. And then the other like phenomena that we've seen from actual individuals who are on the ground, who are sharing their experiences, is how at certain checkpoints or spaces where they're interacting with the armed forces or the occupying forces in this case, that they have specific cultural material that's being confiscated. And so we've even seen this with some of the rights defenders or journalists or individuals who are trying to document what's taking place, that as they're trying to leave the occupied territories and they're meeting with the soldiers or individuals who are at borders, that they end up confiscating this material to prevent the sharing of this information. When it comes to those social media platforms, there's a couple of organizations who have been doing really great work researching this phenomenon. So we've seen Access Now and the International Human Rights Watch, who have been documenting these specific violations online via platforms such as Meta, so that's both Instagram and Facebook, on X, or what's formerly known as Twitter. And then we also have specific organizations that have dedicated research on these issues, such as UNRWA. And what's been interesting is actually, I think UNRWA released a report either this morning or maybe in the last few days that's actually highlighted the ways in which they've seen certain violent rhetoric or discrimination against Palestinians and their heritage as well being perpetrated in the Hebrew language, but that there weren't the means to actually safeguard or moderate this type of content previously on some of these platforms. And so they've been advocating and have had actually some changes that they've been able to propose in the ways that these platforms are moderating content. But that's also increasingly under threat. And we've seen some of the states, including the US, for example, actually rolling back some of the safeguards and civil protections that people would otherwise have. And so that level of accountability for many of these big tech companies may not exist. And so sometimes it is really dependent on people themselves, like populations en masse to engage in that persistence. So kind of forcing the platforms to either adopt to their behavior. So we've seen like, and I've also personally experienced this, which has been quite interesting in my use of social media, seeing how they've been changing like the location of share, the sharing like specific tool. So like there's a button that you share, like click to share content on your stories on Instagram, but they've been moving that throughout what's been taking place. And then we've also seen how they've by default made it so that political content that could be considered violent is not being shared to people. And so you actually have to go and change these settings. So, and they've often done this without people's consent or knowledge. And that the content that's specifically being identified. So when people actually go into like study the algorithms, they're able to see like which specific things are being flagged as being particularly violent. And this could also then include like under sharing things that are connected to the watermelon emoji now, which is not actually inherently violent in itself. And then things like the upside down triangle being another thing, that there's certain symbols that are specifically being deplatformed. And so there's been that documentation or research that's being done by these various like human rights oriented organizations or some of the think tanks within the region. But we're also increasingly seeing this being documented across the board by various cultural institutions or cultural governing institutions, as well as institutions. I think this was like the Carnegie Endowment for Peace has also been doing studies on the specific targeting of cultural heritage using these advanced technologies. I don't know if that answered all of your questions, Melissa. And maybe just to also add, something that's important, I think, for us to acknowledge is that this targeting is also not unique, and that oftentimes it may be seen as like a byproduct of conflict that's taking place. But actually, when we study historically the phenomenon, it's usually quite early on, even before the physical violence may be perpetrated, that culture is often targeted to then manufacture the consent within a wider population to enable that mass violence to be targeted towards a certain population without like a majority of people actually standing up against it. And I think that's why it's so important to see it as not just connected to these specific digital tools, but seeing it as how culture itself has been in some ways manipulated and used to spread propaganda itself. So we've seen how different like media tools, whether it was the radio, when we look at the genocide in Darfur, or also like the destruction of like synagogues during Kristallnacht, so those specific spaces, as being part and parcel to this wider phenomenon of genocide and the committing of mass atrocities and war crimes. So it isn't a byproduct, but it's actually an essential component to these acts that are taking place.
Thank you, Bushra. There's a question also in the chat box. Okay, so Abdisalam is saying, I do have a question and I'm not sure if it was answered or mentioned already, but are there other examples outside Palestinian lands being culturally under threat? Do we see civil conflict within a country also target cultural heritage?
Yes, that's a great question. And that's also part of the reason why I feel like this initiative will be much more broader in scope, because there's unfortunately so many instances in crisis where cultural heritage is under threat. So we've seen this in the case of Syria, and also with some of the recent events or atrocities that have been taking place there, targeting specific minoritized communities. That's of a special or specific concern. I've seen this like in Afghanistan as well, and that's where my like ancestry is from. So I've been paying attention to that like from quite a young age, and seeing how actually there's been quite an underreporting of what's taking place and the erasure of like women in particular from virtual spaces, and the culture and practices that they embody and know also being undermined as a result of that. We've seen this across various indigenous communities around the world. And so it is a wider spread phenomenon. And then there's also the reality that climate crises are also undermining cultural heritage. So it's another form of crisis. And in many ways, they're all intersecting crises, right? They reinforce each other. But that also means that in many ways that we're seeing an expansion of the scope of communities that are being impacted, where their cultures are being threatened.
Thank you. We also have another question on the chat box from Lifteris. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. I was wondering if this cultural destruction is happening also in the attempt to legally call this a genocide. I'm not saying people are trying to portray that way to push their narrative. I'm just curious about the connection of genocide with cultural destruction.
Yeah, so as I mentioned in my presentation, the actual conception of genocide as it was really developed and articulated by Raphael Lemkin, who is a Jewish-Polish legal scholar, included cultural heritage destruction, or the destruction of culture, as being a core component of the concept of genocide, because it was seen to actually threaten the continued existence of the people. So when you're able to undermine the culture of the people, it's very difficult for that community of people to continue to exist as they connect with each other and identify as being part of this community. And seeing actually how, in many ways, that destruction of cultural heritage is used to enforce systems of control and divide and conquer, to be able to erase people's existence, and then also to impose fear upon people, to make the ability of these oppressive regimes or entities to really be able to enact violence on them with little to no repercussion. And so we've seen that at various periods historically. So that's why that connection is so important, and often has been, again, like undermined in various ways, because it's not necessarily captured within our existing legal frameworks, but that was also very much politically motivated. Because as I said, like if we had this specific aspect of cultural heritage, and we do it in some ways have the intention to just destroy people, including like their culture in this case, as part of the Genocide Convention for protections. But there's, I think, much more that needed to be done and included in order to have more effective safeguards in place, and to also then prompt states to both intervene much more quickly before things escalate further. But that will also mean that in cases where we see settler colonies, that they would have to really transform their relationships with the indigenous populations whose lands that they're often occupying, and restore like the ways that they've been engaging with them, but also enacting violence upon them on an ongoing basis.
Thank you very much, Bushra. Do we still have a few more minutes? Do we still have any more questions, comments? Okay, I see none, so I'm going to conclude the seminar. Bushra, thank you so much for the insightful perspective. I very much enjoyed hearing you today, and we were very happy to have you with us in the seminar, and we hope to host you again soon in the future.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, I asked a couple of questions actually in the chat.
Oh, sorry, you just sent it right now.
My bad, so sorry.
Okay, well, if you have time, Bushra, can I read the... Well, if you want, now that you unmuted yourself, you might as well read the questions.
Okay, so the first one is that this project is heavily reliant on network connectivity. So what would be done to address this limitation, considering there might be lots of interruptions to connectivity? And the second is that what I sense from this, there's an assumption that the convening artists and cultural practitioners would be adept at using these technologies digitally and have easy access to them. So I'm just taking experience, like also from like the Rohingya Cultural Memory Center. How would you ensure that cultural crafts, especially from people from older generations or more rural areas, would also be included and represented in this project appropriately?
Yeah, those are great questions. So the first, the project isn't actually solely reliant on network connectivity to be able to advance its objectives. And that's part of what we're actually researching as well. Like, how do we support people on the ground considering these limitations? And so it would be more of a hybrid model. It's something that's developed with the communities themselves. And that includes like working with the Palestinian Cultural Fund itself. So identifying ways that we can support artists and practitioners on the ground with the work that they're doing, and then to also be able to find ways to connect them, both virtually but also in person, with the tools and resources that we need, and with the wider community. And then in terms of the actual use of these tools, I think that's part of the capacity building focus of the initiative, is to be able to share in various ways So there's a proposal, and part of it is to also seek out the resources to be able to do something like this, but to be able to support in-person capacity building and training, and to bring in like different practitioners from various contexts who can share their best practices and lessons learned from other crisis contexts in which they've engaged in, and to be able to, again, foster this like community of practice, to be able to more systematically support the building of capacity, but also to think more critically actually about the use of technologies. So one way that like technology, for example, is being used is to document things in the Arabic language, but much of the existing internet infrastructure doesn't capture like the various subdialects of Arabic that are spoken specifically within the various areas of Palestine itself. And so that can actually contribute to further colonization of their language in these virtual spaces, and erase that language if it's not like the specific language learning models don't take into consideration these various nuances and the various types of language that exist and that are actually being threatened because the very people that carry that knowledge and hold that knowledge and those languages are being targeted and killed. So those are various things that we'd be looking at as part of this initiative and research project. And one of the proposals is to have a fellowship project where we could have various host institutions be able to have some of these Palestinian artists and cultural practitioners, including across generations, to be able to lead their own projects and initiatives based on what they believe are priorities, and looking at that intersection between the use of technology to either support their work or the ways that it's actually being used to hinder their practices and to target their cultural heritage. So there's various components. We're also working with the University of Glasgow on this project or initiative, and have various researchers who have been leading like in-person, like there's the Bethlehem Cultural Festival, for example, that they've been leading for many years now, and have already connections with community on the ground to be able to facilitate some of this knowledge exchange, but also find meaningful ways to even reimagine how we're doing this work, because it is in a crisis context. And I think it's really important to take this outside of academia or scholarship that could be seen as really inaccessible, or as like a space of being like an ivory tower. And it's not just meant to publish for the sake of publishing, but really to try to support more systematic changes and meaningful support for the artists and the cultural practitioners themselves and the population as a whole.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Bushra. Well, I'm not gonna bore everyone and say bye again, but I thank you very much again for being a part of our seminar, and we very much look forward to hosting you again in the future. Best of luck with your research.
Thank you so much. And I'll just put out an invitation if you're interested in participating, or you have any recommendations for us, please feel free to reach out to me at ebadi@unu.edu, and it's on the screen still. So I look forward to connecting with all of you, and wish you a lot of peace and connection as you move through your day, wherever you are.
Thank you. Bye.